Hello everyone. Welcome to the second KUASIA webinar of the 2021-22 academic year. Today we are hosting Professor Minqi Li from the University of Utah. Minqi Li is actually very well-known figure for those interested in the Marxist and world systems approaches to the Chinese political economy. His works provide solid analysis of the changes in economic structures and class relations in China and China's evolving position in the capitalist world economy. Moreover, unlike most academic studies on China, Li's works seriously reflect on the possibilities of political transformation that may shift China and the world towards an alternative path of socioeconomic equality and ecological sustainability. Minqi Li, started his BA degree at Beijing University in China in 1987, I guess. During the larger government crackdown on Tiananmen protests of 1989, Minqi Li was jailed between 1990 and 1992 for defending workers' democracy. Li got his undergraduate degree from the University of Delaware in 1996 and earned his PhD degree from the Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2002. He worked as an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at York University in Toronto between 2003 and 2006. And in the last 15 years, he has been teaching in the Department of Economics at the University of Utah, and he is currently a professor there. Minqi Li has published 6 books, actually. The first book is The Rise of China and the Demise of the Capitalist World Economy, published in 2008. Also, a Turkish translation of this book was published by Epos Yayınları. In 2014, he published Peak Oil, Climate Change and the Limits to China's Economic Growth. In 2016, he published 2 books, actually. One, China and the 21st Century Crisis, and the other, Zibun Zhongji, The End of Capital, a co-authored book published in China in 2016. And in 2020, he published, again, 2 books. One is Capitalist Development and Class Struggle in China, published in Spanish in Argentina. And he also published in English the book titled Profit Accumulation and the Crisis in Capitalism, Long-Term Trends in the UK, US, Japan, and China, 1855 to 2018. In addition to these books, he published many articles and book chapters. Today, Professor Li will present a work that he recently published in Monthly Review. The title of his talk is China, Imperialism or Semi-Periphery. Following his talk, we'll start the Q&A session. You'll turn your microphones on so that you can directly ask questions to the speaker. If you like, you can also write down your questions on the Q&A box here. So Professor Li, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Björk, for your very nice introduction. So these days, of course, many people are interested in China, and largely because China has become a major force in the global capitalist economy. And so China is currently the second largest economy measured by the market exchange rate, but China has already become the world's largest economy measured by purchasing power parity. And so I don't know if people can see all the figures here. Okay, and then as a result of China's economic growth, China has also become a major consumer for some of the major commodities in the world. And like China currently is consuming about 60% of the cement, about 1/2 of the total world consumption of aluminum, more than 1/2 of nickel, about 1/2 of coal, 1/2 of copper, 1/2 of steel, 1/4 of gold. China is also the world's largest oil importer. And then China, again, consumes about 1/3 of the rice, almost 1/2 of the pork, about 1/4 of corn, and about 1/3 of cotton. So China has become the world's leading consumer of many different kinds of raw materials. And then in addition, China has also expanded its investment projects in various parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, partly related to the so-called Belt and Road Initiative proposed by the Chinese government. And so in this context, both within the mainstream literature and then within the different Marxist circles, have been discussion as well as debate about how should we understand China's growing role in the global capitalist system. And in particular, there has been a debate about whether China has become a new imperialist power. So for example, back to 2013, in the American magazine New Yorker, there was this already report which talked about the Chinese capitalist exploitation of the local resources, as well as the violation of local labor rights in Zambia. And in 2018, there were several articles that argued that China perhaps had become a new colonial power. So for example, the Week magazine talks about that China's investment has led to exploitation and ecological disasters in different parts of Africa that were perhaps worse than the historical disasters created by the Western imperialism. New York Times, the leading American newspaper, talk about that China's Belt and Road initiatives have supported the corrupt local dictators and set up death traps, and then also promoted cultural invasions. Financial Times, the leading British newspaper, and also argued that Chinese investment had turned many countries into China's client states. So these newspapers or magazines argue that perhaps China has become a new colonial power that could even be worse than the historical Western imperialism. On the other hand, there has been an interesting debate within the various Marxist circles regarding China's role in the current global capitalist system. So for example, N.B. Turner, who is a kind of international Maoist theorist, argued that China has become a monopoly capitalist country. And to the extent that China has become a monopoly capitalist country, Turner relied upon Lenin's definition of imperialism. And then Turner argued that monopoly Chinese capital has manifested itself through massive exports of capital. And in particular, the state-owned banks have demonstrated the dominance of financial capital. And so because of these features, Turner argued that China had become a capitalist, imperialistic country. David Harvey, who is of course a leading Marxist theorist, well-known international leading Marxist theorist, had also argued at one point that because Chinese government now is holding large quantity of US government securities and also engaged land grab, that is investment in land properties in Africa as well as Latin America, that perhaps suggests China has become a new imperialist power. And then there has also been a debate within China regarding how to understand the China's basic characteristics, especially regarding the relationship between China and the rest of the global capitalist system. And then interestingly, many young Chinese leftists these days believe China has become a new imperialist country. And in particular, Fred Ernst, who is a legendary figure, who is the son of two American revolutionaries who settled in China during the days of Maoist China. So Fred, whose Chinese name is Yang Heping, grew up in China himself. And so he is familiar with both the American conditions as well as the Chinese conditions. So he has become a leading advocate of the theory that China has become an imperialist country. So Fred Ernst also argued that the China's state-owned enterprises have become the world's largest and the most powerful monopoly capitalist group, and that qualified China as an imperialist country. So all of this therefore raised the question about how we should understand China's role in the capitalist world system today. Okay, so to address this question, let's begin Lenin's original thesis on imperialism. Okay, so for Marxist intellectuals, and we are familiar with Lenin's basic argument in the pamphlet on imperialism that was published in the early 20th century. So in that pamphlet, Lenin talked about several key features of the leading capitalist countries at the time. And then Lenin argued that those key features had made those leading capitalist countries imperialist countries by the early 20th century. So among these key features that include concentration of production capital that have become monopolies, the merging of banking capital with industrial capital that created finance capital, the export of capital that acquired exceptional importance, formation of international monopolist capital associations, as well as territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers. So many rely upon these 5 features to identify whether a country has become imperialist or not. But of course, world economic and social conditions have dramatically transformed since Lenin's time. So for example, monopoly capital in Lenin's time was largely limited to a few countries in Western Europe as well as North America. Today, we could basically identify monopoly capital throughout the world. So whether we are talking about core or semi-periphery or periphery part of the world, and virtually in every country, we have various forms of monopoly capitalist groups. And we can say similar things about finance capital. And then also because of the capitalist globalization, and now we have export of capital in various directions by both the core capitalist countries as well as the peripheral capital countries. So this development suggests that when we apply Lenin's definition of imperialism to today's world, we need to be careful about how to adapt to the changing world historical conditions. And then moreover, if one reads Lenin's imperialism carefully, and then basically immediately after Lenin talked about the 5 basic features of imperialism, and then Lenin immediately said that those 5 features by themselves were actually not completely adequate for our understanding of imperialism. And then to have a comprehensive understanding of imperialism, and Lenin said that we need another set of definitions, and that focus on the parasitism and the decay of capitalism by the early 20th century. And then a few years after the publication of the imperialist pamphlet in 1920, in the preface to the French and the German edition to that imperialist pamphlet, and Lenin wrote this paragraph. It is precisely the parasitism and the decay of capitalist characteristics of its highest historical stage of development, that is imperialism. Capitalism has now singled out a handful, less than 1/10 of the inhabitants of the globe, less than 1/5 at the most generous and liberal calculation of exceptionally rich and powerful states which plunder the whole world simply by clipping coupons. Obviously, out of such super profits, it is possible to bribe the labor leaders and the upper stratum of the labor aristocracy. And then Lenin described this development of being both historical importance. Okay, so if you look at this paragraph that Lenin wrote for the preface to the French and the German edition, and so by that time, it seems Lenin had developed this more complete understanding of imperialism. And so from this paragraph, Lenin emphasized that first of all, imperialist countries have to be those countries who are able to exploit the rest of the world and then appropriate super profits, and which could be considered as the profit obtained over and above the profit which capitalists squeeze out of the workers of their own country. So it needs to be super profits appropriated from the monopoly capitalist exploitation that is above the average profit. And then in addition, let me emphasize that the imperialist countries are those a handful countries that can be considered to be exceptionally rich. And then in terms of size of this total group of imperialist countries. And let me emphasize that the population that live in the imperialist countries was probably less than 1/10 of the total world population, and then at most less than 1/5 of the world population. So in other words, the imperialist system has to be a system where the minority of the world population exploits the majority of the world population. It cannot be where a system, a majority or near majority, that exploit the minority of the world population. So if we apply this criteria of super profits, as well as the criteria that the imperial system has to be one where the minority exploit the majority, right? And let's see if China today qualifies for this definition of imperialism. Okay, so first, let's take a look at the so-called international investment position of China. That looks at China's overseas assets as well as liabilities. And so as of the end of 2018, China's overseas assets reached $7.3 trillion. And then the total foreign investment in China, that is like China's overseas liabilities, that was approximately $5.2 trillion. So based on that, China had a net position of $2.1 trillion. That is, China's total assets were greater than the liabilities by $2.1 trillion. Okay. So if we look at this number alone, it does seem like China has developed into a position that begin to resemble a new imperialist power, because China's total overseas assets are greater than the liabilities. But if we take a more detailed look, and so first of all, within the China's total assets of $7.3 trillion, about $3.5 trillion consists of China's foreign exchange reserves, which provide very little rate of return to China. And then if we look at the kind of assets that might provide some rate of return, let's see where is that invested. So if we look at China's foreign direct investment stock as of 2018, so China's total foreign direct investment stock in 2018, that was about $1.6 trillion in total. And out of that, $1.1 trillion, about 2/3 was invested in Asia. But if we look at the total foreign investment, China's so-called foreign investment within Asia, $1 trillion was invested in places in Hong Kong, Macau, and Singapore. And out of that $1 trillion, I think perhaps about $900 million was invested in Hong Kong and Macau alone. Right? And both Hong Kong and Macau, of course, are China's special administrative regions. And then Singapore is a city-state. And then David Harvey talked about China's land grab in Latin America and Africa, right? So let's look at the investment in the rest of the world. Just under $400 billion was invested in Latin America. But within that, $370 billion was invested in Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. And so we know these are not places where an imperialist country could appropriate raw materials. Instead, these are typical tax havens and ideal places for capital flight for corrupt capitalists or perhaps corrupt Chinese officials. And then just more than $100 billion invested in Europe, $90 billion in North America. And again, because these are developed capital countries, it's unlikely to provide super profits or useful raw materials for the Chinese capitalists. And then just about $40 billion was invested in Africa. So if we take a more detailed look, and so if we remove all the investment in China's own special administrative zones, and if we remove those investment in obvious tax havens and the places for capital flight, as well as remove those investment that took place in developed capital countries, and then the remaining part is probably under 5% of China's total foreign direct investment stock. So in other words, just 5% of China's foreign direct investment stock is perhaps direct towards the exploitation of raw materials and energy in places such as Africa and Latin America. And then are the Chinese capitalists making super profits in the rest of the world? So this graph compares the rate of return on average rate of return on China's total investment abroad with the average rate of return on the foreign investment within China. And so this red curve, that's the average rate of return on China's investment abroad. It has averaged just about 3% over the period from 2010 to 2018. And then by comparison, the average rate of return on foreign investment in China has fluctuated in the range of 5% to 6%. So in other words, almost twice as high as China's the rate of return on China's investment abroad. So instead of earning super profits from investment from the rest of the world, China is providing a profit rate that is closer to super profit to foreign capitalists in China. And then this one looks at the net investment income from overseas investment for various Asian countries or regions. Okay. Again, for the period from 2010 to 2018. And so in this case, we are looking at the net investment income. That is the investment income from overseas assets less investment income paid to foreign investment in the country. And then calculating the ratio of this net investment income to GDP. And so for example, if we look at Taiwan, and which is earning positive net investment income from abroad in the range of 1% of GDP or 2% of GDP. And then if we look at Japan, which was a traditional imperialist country before World War II, and now Japan is not only accumulating large overseas assets, but also making significant rate of return, so that its net investment income from abroad is more than 3% of Japan's GDP. And then if we look at Hong Kong, before 2015, Hong Kong's net investment from abroad was about 2% of its local GDP. And then in recent years, it actually surged to about 5% of its local GDP. Now, by comparison, if we look at mainland China, China's net investment income has been consistently in the negative territory. So that means even though on paper, China's overseas assets are greater than its overseas liabilities, but because China has to pay higher rate of return to foreign capitalists within China, China's net investment income has been in the negative territory. So based on the above data, it seems obviously China is not making super profits from its overinvestment abroad. And so how do we understand China's position in the capitalist world system today? Okay. So perhaps a more appropriate approach is to use the world system theory. According to the world system theory, the capital world system can be divided into 3 structural layers. That includes the core, where the world wealth is concentrated, includes the periphery, which historically included the great majority of the world population, and then moreover, surplus is transferred from the periphery to the core. And then finally, we have the layer of semi-periphery that is somewhere in between the core, the layer of the core, and the layer of the periphery. So speaking of the transfer of surplus, and so let's first look at what I call the labor terms of trade. So this variable measures the labor embodied in the unit of commodity exported in the country compared to the labor embodied in the unit of commodity imported by the country. So for example, if we look at the United States, its average labor terms of trade has been consistently high. And so in average, 1 unit of American commodity exported can trade for 1 unit of labor embodied in the American commodities exported, can trade for 4 units of labor embodied in the commodities imported by the United States. So this is consistent with our traditional understanding of the imperialist country as well as the core layer of the capitalist world system. And then by comparison, China's labor terms of trade has been under 1, meaning it takes more labor exported from China to trade for the labor embodied in the commodities imported by China. And then in the 1990s, moreover, in the early 1990s, it will take in average about 20 units of Chinese labor to trade for 1 unit of foreign labor. So that means China suffers heavily from unequal exchange back to the 1990s. And then since then, China's labor terms of trade has improved. But today, it still takes about 2 units of Chinese labor exported to trade for 1 unit of foreign labor imported by China. Now, if we look at China's labor term of trade against various geographic areas, okay, so I see it's already 9:30, so in my time, so in the interest of time, I will not give a detailed explanation of each of these regions. But basically, this curve, this black curve, that is for sub-Saharan Africa. This green curve, that is for South Asia. Okay. So today, if we look at China's term of trade against sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, China has already developed a, you might say, exploiting relationship against Africa and South Asia. And because now it takes 1 unit of Chinese labor to trade for 2 units of African labor or 4 units of South Asian labor. Okay. And then on the other hand, if we look at China's labor terms trade with Latin America, with Middle East, with Eastern Europe, that's roughly similar to 1, roughly around 1. And so that means China's 1 unit of Chinese labor trades for roughly 1 unit of labor from these regions. But if we look at China's term of labor against the US or other high-income countries, it still takes about 5 units of Chinese labor to trade for 1 unit of American labor, or about 4 units of Chinese labor to trade for 4 units of Chinese labor to trade for 1 unit of labor from high-income countries, excluding the United States. So looking at the labor terms of trade, and then China has already established an exporting relationship against Africa and South Asia, but it is still being exploited by US and as well as other high-income countries. But because in average, China's labor term of trade is still below 1. So it still takes about 2 units of Chinese labor to trade for 1 unit of average foreign labor. So that means in average, China continues to transfer more labor through its exports compared to the labor transferred in the form of the labor embodied in the Chinese imports. Okay, so in that way, in average, China is still being exploited by the core part of the capitalist world system. So how should we identify China's position in the world system today? I'll put it another way. And if we talk about 3 different structural layers of the capitalist world system, and then how do we identify whether a country is in the core, in the periphery, or the semi-periphery? Okay. So looking at this graph first, this one compares the per capita GDP index of 4 traditional imperialist countries: United States, United Kingdom, France, and Germany. Okay, so there's no question these 4 countries were the 4 major traditional imperialist countries. So they could represent the standard of imperialism. So in this case, the per capita GDP of each of 4 countries are compared to the weighted average of the 4 countries, which I refer to as the imperial standard. And so in this case, the US per capita GDP has been consistently above the imperial standard. The British per capita GDP used to be above the imperial standard, and by the turn of the century, the British per capita GDP had declined, and then by the late 20th century, the British per capita GDP declined to about 75% of the imperial standard. And then if we look at the French and the German per capita GDP, historically, their per capita GDP had been mostly about 75% of the imperial standard, except during World War I and World War II. So based on this historical imperial evidence, and we could say that if a country's per capita GDP rises above 75% of the imperial standard, and then there will be no question the country had become a part of the core of the capitalist world system. So we can consider this 75% of imperial standard to be the upper boundary of the semi-periphery. And then on the other hand, if we look at the world hierarchy of per capita GDP for all countries where the data is available for the period from 1870 to 1970. Okay, so this graph is kind of complicated. On the vertical axis, again, we are showing the per capita GDP index for all the countries where the data is available compared to the imperial standard. So 100% would be 100% of imperial standard, 75% would be 75% of imperial standard. Okay, so that is a per capita GDP index. And on the horizontal axis, we are ranking all the countries from the country with the highest per capita GDP to the country with the lowest per capita GDP. And then this horizontal axis would show the cumulative share of the world population up to a certain income level. So, and then we draw the curve, and for 1870, 1913, 1950, and then 1970. And so, for example, if we look at the 1870 curve, that is this black curve, and then about 20% of the world population live in countries where their per capita GDP was above 50% of the imperial standard. About 15% of the world population live in countries where their per capita GDP is about 75% of the imperial standard. And then on the other hand, if we look at those countries with the lowest per capita GDP here, you should see these very wide, two pieces of very wide segments. That is India and China, respectively. And because these two countries have the world's largest population, right? And so in 1870, India's per capita GDP and China's per capita GDP was just below 25% of the imperial standard. And of course, in 1870, India was still a colony within the British Empire, and China was already a semi-colony within the capital world system. There was no question that both India and China were part of the periphery of the capitalist world system. So we can consider this 25% of the imperial standard to be the lower boundary of the semi-periphery. So basically from 1870 to 1970, China has been consistently within the periphery of the capitalist world system. That continued to be the case in 1990, in 2000, but by 2017, and so you see that this is the portion of the segment for China. By 2017, China's per capita GDP has already risen significantly above 25% of the imperial standard. And so that can be taken as evidence that by now China has entered into the semi-periphery of the capitalist world system. So, okay, so in addition to this, and there's another interesting observation. So if we look at the part of world population that live in the countries that is above 75% of the imperial standard, historically it has fluctuated just around 15% of the world population. And that is actually similar to Lenin's intelligence guess that the population which live in the imperial countries should be somewhere between 10% of the world population and 20% of the world population. Okay, so if we consider China right now to be a semi-peripheral country within the capital world system, but of course China continue to enjoy rapid economic growth. But will China become an imperial country or rise into the core of the capitalist world system in the future? And of course, China, being a capital country, has got its own contradictions. And but in addition to its internal contradictions, if we again take Lenin's understanding of imperialism, if imperial system is going to be a system where the minority of the world population exploits the majority of the world population, right? And that basic characteristic by itself should rule out a big populous country like China to be a part of the imperialist system. And then regarding China's own contradictions, and even though China has enjoyed rapid economic growth for years, and that economic growth has been based on several forces that are no longer sustainable. So first of all, China's capitalist accumulation, we know that has been based on very intense exploitation of very large cheap labor force. And then in addition, China's rapid growth of labor productivity has been made possible by heavy investment that in Marxist terms has led to rapid increase in organic composition of capital, and therefore that has driven down the profit rate. In terms of the intense exploitation of Chinese workers, the Chinese workers probably works the longest hours compared to all the workers in all the other countries. And so the workers in core capital countries typically work for somewhere between 1,400 hours and 1,800 hours in a year. And then by comparison, an average Chinese worker works for about 2,300 hours a year. And that is even longer than the working hours of Mexican workers or South Korean workers. But China's demographic trends now is undergoing dramatic change. And then in particular, China's prime working age population, and looking at this gray curve, and by that we are talking about the population that is between 25 years old and 59 years old. That is roughly a predictor of China's labor force. Right? Is expected to decline from about 800 million now to about 600 million by the mid-21st century. And then that means China will lose about 200 million workers within its labor force in the next 30 years also. And then on the other hand, if China's urban employment continue to grow, given China's capitalist development, and then China's rural surplus labor force could be completely depleted by the time around 2040. And that will, on the one hand, have major negative implications for China's growth. And then moreover, because of this depletion of rural surplus labor force, that could have to increase the bargaining power of China's working class. And then if that happens, that could have very negative implications for China's capitalist income system. And on top of that, because of the rising organic composition of capital that is taking place within the Chinese economy, that China's profit rate has declined rapidly in recent years. So back to the time of early 2000s, the average profit rate within Chinese economy used to be about twice as high as the American profit rate. But by now, it has already declined to a level that is below the American economy's average profit rate. And then if the current trend continues, the decline of the profit rate could lead to a kind of investment collapse sometime in the future. And then in addition, China's capitalist growth has also been based on unsustainable ecological contradictions. So we know that climate change has become the single most important global ecological crisis that is confronting the humanity. And so this one just shows the historical atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, as well as the historical development of the global surface temperature. And so by now, the global average surface temperature is already more than 1 degree higher than the pre-industrial time. And so for people who are following the climate change development, and we know that if the global warming rises above 2 degrees, if the global warming rises above 2 degrees, that will lead to various kind of climate catastrophes, and that could fatally undermine the global ecological system, and which eventually could undermine the material foundation for human civilization. And so in this respect, And China has already become the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. And so in 2018, China alone accounted for 29% of the world's total carbon dioxide emissions. So unless China participates in drastic reduction of carbon dioxide emissions, there's no way for global climate crisis to be resolved. I would just skip some slides, and because I see it's already almost 9:50 by my time. But basically, if we were to divide up the global emissions budget and with the intention to limit the future global warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial time. And then under different scenarios, and so for example, if we take this equity approach, which basically means divide the global emission budget based on population of different countries, and then China's emissions need to immediately start declining now, and then decline by more than 3% a year. And so this graph actually takes the starting point of decline to be the year of 2018, so before the COVID crisis. And now if we push the data back by a few years, and then it will require an even more drastic path of reduction of emissions. And so if China's emissions were to decline by more than 3% a year, and then if we take the China's historical pace of emission-intensive GDP decline, and then the implied future economic growth rate would be less than 1%. And then moreover, if in the future, because China's emissions have not yet started decline, right? So, and in the future, it's going to require an even more dramatic decline rate of China's carbon dioxide emissions. And moreover, perhaps the decline rate of emission intensity of GDP may not be as optimistic as being suggested here. And then that could actually require zero or negative growth in the future on the Chinese part. And that, of course, would not be compatible with stability, economic or political stability of the Chinese capitalist system. Okay, so for the people who are familiar with the Marxist literature, you know that this is the last paragraph of part 1 of Communist Manifesto, where Marx famously predicted that the bourgeoisie has produced above all its own grave diggers, and therefore its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So that was in 1848. Since then, and actually we have not yet seen a genuine proletarian revolution as was originally imagined by Marx himself. And we know that the working classes in Western Europe and North America did not evolve into revolutionary social classes. The Russian Revolution of 1917, of course, was the Russian Revolution took the form of workers' uprising in major cities, but it happened in the majority peasant country, again, not in the social environment originally imagined by Marx. But now, China has undergoing rapid capital industrialization, and moreover, this rapid industrialization has also produced the world's largest proletarianized working class. So it will be interesting to see in the next several decades, and whether we are going to have the first true proletarian revolution as Marx originally imagined to happen in China. So I would just stop right here, and it will be my pleasure to answer some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Minqi, and now you can ask your questions to the speaker directly. Here we are turning microphones on. Can I ask your question directly, or you can use Q&A box here? Yeah. Yeah, Dirja Mahendra. Yeah, you can ask.
Sure. Thank you very much. Hello, Professor Minqi. Ni hao ma. So,
Hi, ni hao.
I am Dirja. I am Singaporean citizen. Yeah, sure. And I have half Chinese actually. So, as I know that in the revolution of Chinese, there's something which is very important key there for the managing the economic. As I know, there's name is the Chinese rice bowl, and after that, that's like kind of making the the management in the whole of economic in Chinese. But as what you said, like due to the falling the labor in the future of Chinese. Does the Chinese government, I mean, have anything to pursuing that one to the communists again, or they will be changing into the capitalist, I mean, fully capitalist in the future? Yeah, thank you.
Oh, well, so the question is about how to understand China's internal income system, whether there's any chance for China to move towards a kind of social system again, right? And so I would say there, perhaps there was still some debate back in the 1990s, but by now there has been consensus among the Chinese leftists that China has developed into a fully capitalist economic system, and in terms of its internal system, and in the sense that the capitalist economic relations and have become completely dominant within the Chinese economy. And then even if you just look at the legal ownership, the officially recognized private enterprises have also dominated the Chinese economy in terms of employment, value of output, industrial sector output, etc. Right? So there's no question that China now is dominated by the capitalist economic relations. And then regarding whether China could again become a socialist country, perhaps after some fundamental political change, after some fundamental political transformations, but not under the current political regime. And so even though the ruling party in China still calls itself a Communist Party, but in terms of the actual social class it represents, in terms of its political and economic policy actually implemented, it all serves the interests of domestic and the foreign capitalist class. And so the current Chinese state merged with the interests of the capital class. And so I do not see the scenario that the current Chinese political system takes initiative voluntarily to move back towards a socialist scenario.
Yeah, there are.
So I see there's a comment in the chat asking me to share the slides through email. So I guess I will email my slides to Birak afterwards, and then Birak can share it with everyone. Right?
Certainly, yeah. Next question will come from Hasan Tekküç.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Professor Minqi Li, thanks for the presentation. I missed the first 20 minutes. I barely made it. Sorry for that. My question regarding is connected to the previous question. And this relates to the, what about some more reforms in the direction of more social welfare state? How do you see their possibility? Especially I'm asking because you mentioned the working hours, and a package of social reforms such as reducing the weekly hours and strengthening the pension system and maybe the health system, kind of not a real welfare state in the Western European sense, but at least more security, old age security, and in that sense, can you see reforms coming in the next decade? Thank you.
Well, speaking of the effect of reform, so I guess I can say that both China and Turkey can be considered as a semi-peripheral country. And then being semi-peripheral countries, I guess we can understand that there's usually a large discrepancy between what is stated in official statements or official laws and then what is actually going on in reality. Right? So I guess China and Turkey probably share that similarities. Right? And so in that regard, regarding working hours, there has not been practical and effective measures from the Chinese government regarding actually limiting the working hours in the capitalist enterprises. And despite growing resentments and the protests from not only the urban working class, but also from some sections of the petty bourgeoisie, or you might call it urban middle class. Yeah. Now, regarding the possibility of welfare state, over the past several months, and interestingly, there has been some growing, I should say, so there has been a growing number of official statements, declarations, or articles published in party newspapers, which argue that the party is going to emphasize a new direction towards the so-called common prosperity or shared prosperity. But despite these new statements, when it comes to the actual policy to be implemented, and then if you read those more detailed explanations, and they say that there are 3 different ways to change the income distribution in a way that could contribute to shared prosperity. There is this possibility to change the primary national income distribution, and regarding the distribution between the so-called factor incomes. Okay, so even though it's the article by the Communist Party paper, they did not use the Marxist word. They used the typical words by bourgeois economics, right? Factor income. And then secondly, they would work on possible secondary redistribution that has to do with taxes and the transfer payments. And thirdly, there is the possibility of tertiary income distribution. That refers to mechanism for capitalism, for capitalists to make donations or contribution to charities. And so they talk about these 3 mechanisms. So first of all, there's no mention at all about changing the structure of ownership or means of production. And there's no discussion about changing the structure so that the public ownership of means production could again become a majority part of the economy. No discussion about that. And then secondly, between the 3 mechanisms we just talked about, it turns out the most important one they would rely upon is going to be the so-called tertiary redistribution, the capitalist donations or contribution to charities. And so you could imagine how effective that is going to be. So in the foreseeable future, I do not see the Chinese state is going to move seriously towards anything that would resemble a welfare state.
Thank you very much. Nabuhide Mert Matsumoto has a question.
Thank you for giving me a chance to ask my question and for presentation, Professor. I want to ask that we witnessed a rise in the automation of workforce, and China also invests much in artificial intelligence and robotics for competing the West. So could this be a solution for China's being scarce workforce problem, and how this could affect China's internal societal system? This is my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This is a very good question. So many people are interested in these effects of robots or automation in general, or so-called artificial intelligence. There have been, of course, debates about this. I cannot say I know the definitive answer, but I can share with you my personal understanding. My feeling that the overall social effects of robots or automation perhaps have been greatly exaggerated. Now, the example I would often use is that let's look at agriculture, right? So that is the oldest industry of human economy. And so agriculture has existed for so many years. And then despite several hundred years of capitalist development, even today, much of agriculture in much of the world is still not fully mechanized. So that suggests there are perhaps some natural limits to the degree of mechanization or automation in the economy. And then within China itself, despite this rapid progress of mechanization and automation in some sectors, it continues to rely upon exploitation of cheap labor. And then in particular, China's urban sector is still growing. And so urban employment continues to expand at the pace of about 10 million each year. So that suggests that the Chinese capitalist economy continue to rely upon this expansion of labor force itself in order to grow. And then even if we look at some of the so-called high-tech sectors, like the so-called gig economy. So whether we are talking about the online delivery sector, or whether we are talking about something that is similar to Uber in China, and those sectors are actually highly labor intensive and relying upon millions of workers to work long hours in order to support the so-called high-tech sector. And then in addition, there are capitalist limits to the degree of automation and mechanization. And because China already suffers from this falling profit rate caused by rising organic consumer capital. So if the Chinese capitalists are going to rely more upon even higher degree of mechanization, that could accelerate the decline of the profit rate and therefore accelerate the coming of the future economic crisis. So that would be self-defeating for the Chinese capitalist system.
Özge Kotan has a question.
Ni hao, Professor.
Ni hao.
I'm a PhD student in Fudan University, but now I'm stuck in Turkey because of pandemic. So my question will be a bit general, but I would like to hear your opinion about the relations of China regarding international organizations. Actually, specifically, I'm interested in WTO. So what do you think about future position or role China around the discussions of multilateral relations or multipolarity? you know, there are so many, I don't want to say disputes, but there are so many discussions about Chinese policies regarding WTO rules. So I would like to have your opinion. What will be the future role of China in the WTO?
I have to say, yeah, thanks for the question, but I have to say that is probably an area I'm really not too familiar with. And so I guess I could say that China's entry into the World Trade Organization played a crucial role for China to become a major export platform in the world manufacturing industry. That is for sure. And then, in relation to that, China has also contributed to the overall growth of the neoliberal global capitalist economy. And then regarding China's role in WTO or China's the future policy towards WTO or similar international agreement, I don't have much to say, except I think right now there has been some debate within the Chinese ruling elites and regarding what policy they should take towards the rest of the global capitalist economy. And there is one faction that is also traditionally the dominant faction within the Chinese ruling elites that argue that China should be satisfied with its current role to be a part of the leading manufacturing export and given its position as a semi-peripheral economy within the capitalist world system. And then China should continue to use this position and try not to challenge the American hegemonic power. And I think this kind of position has a large number of followers within the Chinese ruling class. And on the other hand, there has also been some indication and that would suggest that some elements among the Chinese ruling class, and perhaps including Xi Jinping himself, has by now developed stronger ambition. And they want to create conditions so that China in the future would become a core part of the capital system. And then perhaps China could even establish itself as the future hegemonic power. I do not see this faction to be quite dominant within the Chinese ruling class. And even if they eventually become temporarily dominant, I do not see their policy to be successful in the future. But in any case, based on my understanding, I do not see either of the two factions have developed a clear policy regarding China's role in relation to various international organizations, except some issue by issue tactic or strategy. So I guess that's the best I can say at this point.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions. So first, you explained that Chinese capital's rate of return abroad is, relatively lower compared to the capitals of other capitals of imperialist countries, and Chinese capital has, a low profitability again compared to the imperialist countries' capital. And how do you see the reasons of this? Is it an issue of backwardness in technology, R&D, and similar stuff? And if you think this is the case, then how do you understand this? You know, you already mentioned, you know, Xi Jinping represents a more like ambitious sort of faction. And 2 weeks ago, we hosted How Cheese Talk, but the topic was different. But in one of his papers, he makes the case that basically the Chinese government currently tries to sort of suppress these financial speculators in order to push for more, you know, pro-innovation wing of capital. So probably they see it as a way to increase China's chance to become a core country, imperialist country. So how do you see, you know, these policies? Are these policies, you know, already paying dividends, helping China to improve its position? And finally, the separate question, you know, again, in relation to what you already mentioned about Xi's faction, more ambitious nationalist faction versus others and so on. Again, there is so much talk about this, you know, geopolitical tensions between China and US and US and its allies. So do you see a sort of a growing threat of war between China and US? As a sort of, again, in one way you can read it as an attempt to stop China, consolidate China at a semi-peripheral position and prevent its rising to an imperialist position.
Okay, so many interesting and not so easy questions from Iraq. Okay, I guess let me start. Okay, so first of all, regarding the question about why China's overseas investment is making relatively low rate of return, I think is a subject that would require further research. But just right now, based on the current evidence, and then if you just look at the composition of China's overseas assets, and first of all, a big part of that, about 40%, consists of China's foreign exchange reserves. And that, of course, derives from the situation where China's currency cannot function as the international reserve currency, right? And so that cannot provide a high rate of return. And then if you look at foreign direct investment, and as we talked about earlier, about 2/3 is invested in Hong Kong and Macau. And then another big part, about 1/4, is invested in places like Cayman Islands, and then like the American British Virgin Islands, right? So those places of tax havens, right? And so even though that might still require some more detailed research, but it will not be surprising to find that investment that takes place in these kind of places are actually capital flights or money laundering instead of profit-making investment. And so actually we have got some anecdotal evidence that the investment, for example, in places like Cayman Islands or Virgin Islands includes properties owned by family members of top Chinese Communist Party officials. Right? So if that is the case, and then their investment, the purpose of their investment is simply money laundering, but not to make profit. And then you only have maybe about 5% that is invested in, say, Africa, Latin America, in order to exploit the local raw materials. So even if that 5% could give you reasonable rate of return, the overall average rate of return will still be low. So that is about the first question. The second set of question about whether the industrial policy, China's current policy is helping to promote industrial upgrading, and then potentially help China to develop its high-tech sector, and then therefore eventually help China to develop into core countries. Okay. So on that question, let's say there are several reasons why China would not evolve into a core country, in addition to the various fundamental contradictions we talked about earlier. Right? And so first of all, about Chinese government's current policy to promote the high-tech sector. Despite this like the newly developed official emphasis about industrial program, such as Chinese manufacturing 2025 or Chinese manufacturing 2030, that has listed several top priority of high-tech sectors. But these programs were not like the programs under the former socialist planning. It's not even like the former industrial policy like what was used to be developed by South Korea or Japan during their years of rapid development. So if you look at the Japan's or South Korea's industrial program in the time of 1960s or 1970s, and it's more than just typical capitalist industrial policy. And actually you could call the Japanese program or South Korean program a kind of quasi-planned economy under the framework of very effective developmental state. And then today, China's industrial policy has most similarities with industrial subsidy programs in places like the United States than the historical quasi-planned economy under South Korea or Japan. So even though it's called industrial policy, it has not developed into a coherent and well-coordinated program. It's just listed several areas, and then the government would provide some money, which would provide subsidies to capitalists, and then the various capitalist groups would use all kinds of tricks, and in order to get a portion of this government subsidy, including tricks that may not be related to actual effective high-tech program. And so they could repackage some existing industrial program and then call that high-tech, and then provide some well-developed presentation, and then use all their available political connections as well as a mechanism of corruption in order to simply for the purpose of getting a share of the government subsidy and then profit from that subsidy. So this kind of program in many cases has led to failed projects instead of promoting effective high-tech industrialization. And then even if we look at a few successful cases, like the Huawei company, right? So even Huawei company is famous for its sweatshop-like working conditions. It's famous for its so-called 996 regime. That is the engineers and workers are expected to work from 9 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock in the evening, 6 days in a week. And that is just the regular hours. And then in addition, there will be additional expected working hours. Okay. And so that has imposed very high intensive work on even relatively privileged petty bourgeois professional workers. So for even for those who can earn something like 500,000 Chinese yuan, and which is a very high wage in China, almost like the $100,000. That those kind of workers are subject to this kind of very intense work discipline, right? And but so far we have got just one Huawei, and then that is to some extent could claim to be near the leading edge of one particular industry in the world, right? But China has got, of course, 1.4 billion population, and then to lift the entire China into the core of the capitalist world system, you need definitely one Huawei would not be enough. Even dozens would not be enough. Hundreds may not be enough. You might need thousands Huawei-like companies, and then with sufficient monopoly profits so that the Chinese workers do not have to be subject to 996 regime. So there's no realistic way for that to happen. Okay, so regarding the last set of questions and whether the US-China conflict would develop into uncontrolled conflict or even major wars, I do not see that happening. And I'm still thinking that despite all the growing tensions between Chinese capitalism and American capitalism, and the fundamental interests between the Chinese capitalists and the American capitalists are still consistent with one another. So China is still the world's largest manufacturing exports. And then much of the Chinese capitalists rely upon this prosperity of the Chinese manufacturing exports. And then on the other hand, China's manufacturing exports play a crucial role in transferring surplus value from the exploitation of Chinese workers towards transnational corporations in the Western world, in particular towards the transnational corporations based in the United States. And then in addition, the competition of Chinese goods also contribute to undermining the bargaining power of American workers. So in this regard, I think the majority part of the American capitalist class and the majority part of the Chinese capital class continue to think that their fundamental interest lies with cooperation with each other rather than conflict with each other. But of course, despite this, their shared fundamental interests, and now we have growing contradictions within the American capitalism, and as well as within the Chinese capitalism. And so this kind of internal contradiction could make the situation more complicated, including CS developing his own ambition, including, say, a possible comeback by Trump in 2024. And we see that the political climate in the United States is changing, right? But despite this kind of growing internal contradictions, and I do not see this kind of internal tensions would fundamentally change the current link between the American capitalist class and the Chinese capitalist class. That is one part of the reason. And then another part of the reason is that there's no possibility in the near future for China to develop a military capability to challenge the American power on the global scale or even on the regional scale. So even though American power is declining, there's no question about that. The American hegemonic power is declining. And so that means the American capitalism is less and less able and willing to regulate the interests of global capitalist system. And therefore we are having a growing geopolitical instability in different parts of the world. But the Chinese capitalism is in no position to replace the US, to become the next hegemonic power. It's definitely in no position to replace the US to have to contribute to geopolitical stability in the Middle East, just for example. And then even in the East Asian regional area, China is far from developing into a dominant position. So in addition to the US hegemonic power, China is also challenged or confronted by Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and then say India, and so all of this could limit the potential reach of Chinese power. So basically, I do not see a scenario of China to replace the US to become next hegemonic power, and then there is very little chance for major military conflict to happen between the two powers.
Thank you. The final question of the webinar comes from Veysel Tekdal.
Thanks, Burak Hocam. Thank you, Minqi Li. I much like your presentation. I think this is a quite solid case for putting China into semi-peripheral position. But two particular features of China's political economy, I think, point that China is not a typical kind of semi-peripheral economy. First of all, it's a capital abundant economy, unlike other semi-peripheral economies like Mexico, Turkey, India, Brazil, etc. China is not, at least we can say that China's dependence on foreign capital is not comparable to others. They do not have, large capital to invest outward. Secondly, you already mentioned that China is close to edge in some sectors. You gave example of Huawei. And I would say China is close to the technological edge in some other future technologies like electric vehicles, other green technologies, artificial intelligence, etc. So these two particular features seems to me that differ China from other semi-peripheral countries. What do you think? They are important indicators or they are not? Thank you.
Okay, so there are definitely differences between China and the rest of the semi-periphery. And so, for example, if you look at the Latin American semi-peripheral countries, or if you look at Russia, they rely upon exports of the energy products and the natural resources. And then by comparison, China specializes in exports of manufacturing in the capitalist world system. So it's the leading manufacturing export in the global capitalist economy. So that means China has largely completed capitalist industrialization. That also means China has a very large industrial sector. And so that does have implications, but that implication itself does not mean China will become a core country in the future. And because even though China is the world's largest industrial producer, it's not the industrial producer with the largest monopolistic profit. So it has not developed that control over the monopolist profit that would allow it to become a part of the core capitalist system. So companies like Huawei, that is more like the exception than the rule, the great majority, tens of thousands average Chinese enterprises are still like the traditional kind of firms based on sweatshop exploitation. And then even Huawei, as I said earlier, rely upon the 996 regime. And then, but regarding the China's large industrial sector, it does have one important implication. That means it has contributed to China's social structure transformation. So it has contributed to the forming of the world's largest proletarianized working class. And this development may have the most significant implication for the future in the sense that in the coming decades, we are going to reach a stage where these China's growing working class as well as the petty bourgeoisie will eventually develop economic political demands that can no longer be accommodated by China's existing capitalist regime. And then when that happens, I think the most interesting development will take place. So let's see what will happen in the next several decades.
Okay, thank you. So Minqi, thanks so much for this fascinating talk. And I would like to thank the participants for asking very interesting questions. So thank you so much and have a good day.
Okay, thank you. My pleasure.